Welcome to Unit 4, Facilitate Responsible Behaviour. There are 6 parts: residence culture, interaction with students, observing and monitoring, responding to student behaviour, aggressive and violent behaviour, self-harm and suicide. Effective boarding practice creates a strong current of positive student behaviour, all heading in the same direction like a strongly flowing river. New students entering will be drawn along by this current of positive behaviour. We call this the river or the current of positive student behaviour, and this relies very much on the actions of management and staff. A strong current of positive student behaviour requires a dynamic positive residence culture. A dynamic positive residence culture also has a physical environment that's clean, vibrant, homely, inviting, activities that are interesting and engaging. Eric Jensen says we often treat the symptoms with strategies and not the causes. One of the causes is that students are not engaged and don't feel connected with other students. Question 1 asks, what is the relationship between student engagement in the boarding program and student behaviour? When students are engaged actively in interesting, engaging activities, they're less likely to have the time or opportunity for poor behaviour. Part 2, interactions with students. Interactions with students should be fair, just, humane, equitable and positive, but what does this actually mean? Fair means treating students equally without favouritism or discrimination. Just, interactions are morally right and fair. Humane, showing kindness, care and empathy. Equitable, giving reasonable support to all boarders based on their needs. And positive, connected, optimistic and hopeful interactions. The second part of this question asks the difference between equality and equity. Equality is giving each student the exact same resource. Equity is distributing all resources based on needs to bring all up to the same level. And you can see this quite clearly from this diagram on the left. The difference between equality, when everybody gets the same, to equity, when everybody gets what they need based on their needs. Legal, ethical and organisation requirements. Boarding staff must facilitate responsible behaviour within state and federal laws. For example, we don't have corporal punishment anymore. It's illegal. Ethical standards. So we're talking about things like staff to student boundaries and boarding residents' code of conduct, policies and procedures. Question 3 asks you, what is the name of your organisation's policy on student behaviour and where can you locate this? Is it in a file? Is it on a computer drive? Where is this document? So that's question 3. A strong current of positive student behaviour requires strong, caring staff to border relationships. So relationships are so important. Genuine, nurturing relationships, professional relationships between boarding staff and students are essential to facilitating positive behaviours. Building positive relationships, there's 6 parts to this: showing genuine interest, being approachable and consistent, treating students with respect, empowering young people, modelling positive behaviour and building trust over time. So let's unpack that. Showing genuine interest. Take the time to understand young people, including their family, their community, their interests, hobbies and goals. Ask open-ended questions to encourage young people to share about themselves. Just be present and attentive during conversations, not watching out for your phone, etc. Be approachable and consistent. Maintain a friendly, welcoming manner. Establish clear and fair boundaries to provide a sense of security. Consistency in your behaviour builds trust and reliability. Treat young people with respect. Listen actively without interrupting. Try and avoid judgmental language. Instead, offer constructive feedback. Recognise and respect individual differences, including cultural backgrounds and preferences. Stay flexible and adaptable to better connect with young people. Empowering young people, this is so important. Encouraging young people to express their opinions and feelings. Involve them in the decision-making process whenever you can, whenever this is appropriate. Validate their experiences and their emotions. Even if you don't fully agree, you can still validate those emotions and experiences. Provide opportunities for young people to take responsibility and make decisions. Model positive behaviour. Demonstrate kindness, patience, sometimes that's difficult, and empathy in your interactions. Be a role model in handling challenges and conflicts respectfully. Admit mistakes and show how to take responsibility. And build trust over time. Follow through on promises and commitments. Keep confidence when appropriate. Be patient and consistent, as trust takes time to develop. Communication strategies. This is question 5. First part of this is just make sure your messages are clear. Communicate goals clearly. Communicate ideas in short, simple manner. Ask for feedback. Clarify ideas when necessary and check for understanding. Be predictable. When boarders realise your reaction or your conversation is consistent, calm and controlled, they will be less inclined to persist in challenging you because they realise that the result will be the same. Concise. Messages should be short and to the point. Respectful. Remain professional and speak with respect. Model the behaviour that you want to see. Use directive language. And there's several parts to this, and we want to look at this first of all, pleading statements. So we should refrain pleading statements. We should not use pleading statements. So a pleading statement is, could you please be quiet and listen? I really need you to pay attention. Can you see the pleading in that? So instead we should be saying something like, settle down please guys, a couple of students need to listen. Thank you. So we're not pleading, we're just using directive language. Follow up on this. Instead of saying, I told you to be quiet, why are you boys still talking? You might say something like, excuse me, Jack and Robbie, we can chat after I'm finished. Right now we need to do some things. So ignore any sulking as you refocus the group. Avoid confrontation. Instead of saying, don't look at me like that, I told you to get a move on, now you've got an extra duty. So avoid that sort of confrontation. Try ignoring the bait and keeping the group momentum. Those who've finished their duties, they're now able to be checked off. Thank you. So that's sort of directive language, not confrontational. Try to use directive language positively. So frame what you want to say in a positive manner. Focus on what the students should be doing rather than what they're not doing. Remind boarders of expectations and provide choice. We've got residence rules about safe and healthy standards. You've got a choice to make. You can work to that standard now or be repeating this cleanup later. So that's about using that directive language, which is quite important, and you may want to go back over that and just reread that. Maybe practice it. Non-verbal communication is very important. It enhances understanding, and of course it can cause misunderstanding too if it's done the wrong way. It reinforces authority and expectations. It encourages positive behaviours, reduces misunderstandings, builds trust and connection, manages without verbal interruption. So we need to just watch and manage our non-verbal communication, our body language. We want to look at assertive communication. What is assertive communication? It's being able to stand up for what you believe is right, ask for what you want, say no to what you do not want in a way that's confident, calm, and respectful. So how to be more assertive? Assertiveness is a skill that can be built and developed over time. You can use techniques like this, starting small, making imperfect decisions, and we all do that. Not apologising if you haven't done anything wrong, getting comfortable with saying no, not trying to manage how other people feel. So Assertive communication is being able to stand up for what you believe is right, ask for what you want, say no to what you don't want in a way that's confident, calm and respectful. And we need to be assertive in a boarding context when we're trying to facilitate positive behaviours. Question 9 asks you to rate yourself as to how you usually perform and model these behaviours in confronting or difficult situations in the residence. Either I do it confidently, I do it occasionally, or I need to do it more often. Young people with a disability. Special needs education in Australia has an inclusive approach where most students attend a general school wherever possible. Education providers are required by law to make reasonable adjustments to allow a student with disabilities to be educated on the same basis as other students. Disability or difficulties. The Disability Discrimination Act and the Disability Standards are for people who have total or partial loss of bodily or mental functions. So the Australian government supports the rights of young people with disability to have the same educational opportunities. They have 6 categories: autism spectrum disorder, hearing impairment, intellectual disability, physical impairment, speech language impairment, and visual impairment. The legal frameworks are the Disability Discrimination Act, 1992, Disability Standards for Education, 2005, the Australian Education Act, 2013, and the National Disability Insurance Scheme, NDIS, 2013. Question 10. The main legislation is the Commonwealth Disability Discrimination Act, 1992, which they call DDA. It imposes legal obligations not to discriminate against people with a disability. In practical terms, this means that boarding schools and residents must ensure that a person with a disability is not discriminated against, and they must make changes to any practice or procedures that deliberately or inadvertently discriminate against young people. There's also state and territory legislation, and you can see it on this slide here. Part 3, Observe and monitor effective student supervision processes. A strong current of positive student behaviour requires effective supervision processes. And this is part of our duty of care. We have a legal duty to protect students from harm, and ensuring positive student behaviour helps protect a student from harming another student or being harmed by the actions of others. So that's the connection between duty of care and behaviour. Staff-student ratios. The correct ratio is essential for care and safety of students to maintain a safe environment that enables positive behaviour. But there are no mandated ratios in the boarding standard. The boarding standard says the requirements for boarder care and supervision include carry out a risk management process to determine the ratio of trained staff to boarders for all circumstances. So that's how we determine the number of staff on duty and which staff are actually on duty at any given time. Observing and monitoring students is very important to provide an optimal duty of care, to meet students' needs, to support holistic development, to be aware and to respond to signs of concern. And so that's being there, being around the students, being where the students are, so that if there are issues that come up or if there's signs of concern, then we can be there and deal with that. Acknowledging positive behaviours, strengths and growths. Observing, monitoring students, there are some informal and there's some formal methods. So informal is observation, just observation of behaviour, body language, etc. as we're supervising students and moving amongst students. Feedback from students, parents and others. Complaints from students and others. Supporting young people to self-monitor themselves. Checking in with others, colleagues and service providers. Those they're informal ways of monitoring students. Formal ways include incident reports, interviews of students and others, checklists, regular mentoring sessions, a formal monitoring tool such as a student tracking form, pastoral care, handover notes, case notes, behavioural observation record or chart, or a behavioural contract. This is a student tracking form, and these forms are provided to students, and students will probably do these in a small group of, say, 10 students, and they'll put down a number from 1 to 10 for each of those criteria on the left-hand side. And boarding residences change these depending on their context and depending on their age of the students that they're doing this form with. And so students will put down a 1 to 10, and it's a way of seeing if there's any issues. If students suddenly start putting down a 3 or a 4 or something for something like meals, then you'll realise that there's a problem here that needs to be addressed. Sometimes we have urgent issues. So during observation, we would screen for issues or potential harm. Some behaviours may show risk of harm to themselves, harm to another student, such as conflict or bullying situation, harm or abuse from another person. Things that we should be looking out for are things like pacing, agitation or fidgeting, raised voices, a tone of voice, high tone of voice, sighing or rolling of the eyes, defensive posture, arms crossed, withdrawn, or very quiet and distracted, or maybe a student is glaring. So all of these are sort of signs that we should be looking out for. When we're observing and evaluating behaviour, we must be fair, objective and consistent. Fair, we must treat students equally, no favouritism or discrimination. Objective, so unbiased, no personal feelings, just the facts, and consistent, the same judgments over time. So this is for question 18. Part 4, responding to student behaviour. Student behaviour ranges from positive, inclusive, respectful behaviour, which is the sort of behaviour we want to see from young people, to serious behaviours of concern. The 4 types of behaviour are positive, inclusive, respectful behaviours, and with these we want to encourage these behaviours. We want to identify and recognise young people when we see these behaviours. Secondly, we have low-level, age-appropriate misbehaviours. And when I think of these, I think of young people just being rowdy or noisy. And these are not really misbehaviours, they're just age-appropriate behaviours. So we can redirect young people, minimise these through universal behaviour support strategies, which we'll talk about in a moment. Then we have challenging and disruptive behaviours. So that might mean when a student refuses to follow instructions, using verbal abuse towards other students, that sort of things. These sort of challenging and disruptive behaviours. Again, we use universal behaviour support strategies and targeted responses, and that may include things like consequences. Then we have serious behaviours of concern. So that might be things like bringing alcohol or drugs onto the residence, or assaulting and injuring another student. We would use a functional behaviour assessment, individual and intensive behaviour plans, and we'll talk about those more in a moment. And we would collaborate with parents and other professionals. We'd certainly bring the head of boarding and the school principal into that conversation as well. So universal behaviour support would include defining and teaching of expected behaviours, and we do that using a matrix like this with expectations, the settings, where they are, that sort of thing, and examples of skills. Encouraging expected behaviours by signs, reward systems, reinforcement, etc. Consistent routines, interesting, engaging activities, and effective and active supervision. And you can see another one of those matrices here that's more aligned with boarding. And you can see the expectations, the settings, transitions, moving from one place to another, their room, and the boarding community. When we're doing these, we would ask, Was our matrix developed collaboratively? Did we involve students in developing the matrix? Are the settings relevant to our particular boarding house, our boarding context? Have you used positive language? Is the language understandable and acceptable to your school community? Have you included social, emotional, and behavioural skills? Other ways we can support positive behaviours are through silent signals. Create silent signals to remind people to pay attention. It can be for the whole group or for one person. This is very effective to quickly reinforce expectations. So it might be just holding a finger up to your lips or holding a hand up for quiet or whatever. Proximity. It's a good silent intervention. Getting physically closer to a young person, you can redirect their behaviour. Quiet correction. Some negative behaviour can be attention seeking, so quietly whisper an instruction to the student, and this effectively does two things. It removes the audience. It also removes the possibility of that student losing face or being shamed through what you're saying to them and other people hearing that. With quiet correction, you may remain in control of the situation and you also keep the student's privacy. Sometimes it's appropriate and helpful to give a student a task or an errand to complete. This gives a student a chance to reset and come back. Pairing the student up with a buddy can also help as well. One option with behaviours is to ignore them. With behaviours that we're not happy with, you can just ignore them. And I remember a young person in one of my classes, he would tap a pencil on the table like that, and he was just doing it to annoy, and if I ignored that, it would eventually go away. If a behaviour is low level, it can be ignored, and then this behaviour might stop. Never ignore behaviour that could harm a person or damage property, or behaviour that is a clear breach of residence rules. This can be sometimes difficult as it doesn't always render an immediate result. Here's some basic guidelines for ignoring. So firstly, give no recognition to the student, no eye contact, no physical contact in any way, and do not in any way acknowledge the student. Be consistent. Ignoring once and paying attention the next time will increase the problem. Then as soon as the behaviour stops, you recognise the student and combine it with encouraging positive behaviour. Responding to behaviour, understanding the causes. If we can understand what causes challenging behaviour, we can more effectively address the behaviour. And here's some possible causes of behaviour. Biophysical factors like medical conditions or disability, psychological factors such as trauma or lack of social skills, behaviour or social factors such as a learned problem behaviour through reinforcement, consequences or adapting to social practices. For example, a student misbehaves knowing they'll be removed from the classroom and then they avoid their learning difficulty being exposed. That's a school type cause. Historic community factors. Some Indigenous students, family members have had difficult trauma experiences of school. Cultural factors, such as sorry business in Indigenous communities. Student group dynamics, bullying and teasing, cliques, apathy and hostility. Environmental factors like the level of noise in a dining room or recreation room, etc. And then you can have things like staff issues. And so these are things that we actually cause ourselves. They're not an issue with the student so much. So inconsistent routines, ineffective supervision, or lack of awareness of cultural differences. Boarding program factors such as lack of engaging activities, students being bored, or just a disorganised program. Behaviour management factors, overreaction to a misbehaviour or over-reliant on punishment or consequences. Very often there's no single cause, but there may be a combination of factors that cause a particular behaviour. And this will help you with question 20. Sometimes there are cultural factors in behaviours, and so we need to respond to behaviour just taking these cultural factors into account. So, for example, there might be different communication styles within a culture, different levels of respect for authority, religious practices in different cultures, social hierarchies, family expectations, and differences in discipline and conflict resolution in different cultures. So let's talk about consequences. Responding to behaviour with consequences can help a young person to take responsibility for their actions. There's two types of consequences, natural and logical consequences. A natural consequence has no adult cause, so a student forgets to get his weekend leave form in on time and he misses out on leave. Or a student who spends all their pocket money on the first day will have nothing for the weekend. So young people learn from these natural consequences of their own decisions. Then there is a logical consequence. This is when an adult intervenes with a consequence that flows from poor behaviour. For example, a student who painted graffiti on the wall is asked to clean off that graffiti, to remove the graffiti. A student who is loud and disruptive in the TV room may be banned from using the TV room. We want to look at some types of negative consequences, and there's 10 here, and these are in a hierarchy, and different organisations will have their own hierarchy of consequences, negative consequences. So the first one is non-verbal, and so this could be a sign or a signal from a boarding supervisor. So it could be something like a raised hand or a finger to the lips. The second type of consequence is a short verbal consequence, so a brief comment given in response to the behaviour, reminding a young person of the correct behaviour. We don't run in this building, we walk, or we walk in this building. Correction. So a student is required to correctly display the desired behaviour. So if a young person runs down the hall, have them return and walk instead. An opportunity to do it right. Restitution. A young person is required to correct the result of negative behaviour. So if they break something, they're required to repair or pay for it. Loss of privilege. A young person uses their phone late at night in breach of the phone use agreement. For a week, they're required to hand their phone in at bedtime. Or time out. A young person's removed from an activity or a location. The student is loud and disruptive when other students are watching a movie, so the student's required to leave the theatre and sit in the office. A task. The young person is allocated a task or additional duties. So the student is swearing and using abusive language. Students required to carry out a 1-hour cleaning task. We need to note here that students are aware that if they use abusive language, the consequence will be additional duties. A conference with the head of boarding or the school principal. The young person's involved in a conference with senior staff to discuss their behaviour and strategies to change the behaviour. So, for example, when asked to leave the TV room and go to bed, a student refuses to follow instructions and remains in the TV room for another 10 minutes. This same behaviour has occurred before. The student's required to attend a conference with senior staff to develop strategies to change that sort of behaviour. A conference with parents. As a result of a serious negative behaviour, the student's involved in a conference with senior staff and parents or guardians to discuss the behaviour and strategies to change the behaviour. For example, a student brought alcohol to the residence, shared it with other students. The student's required to attend a meeting with the head of boarding and their parents to discuss the incident and any further consequences of the incident. And then suspension. As a result of a very serious negative behaviour, the student is suspended from the boarding residence for a period of time. A student starts a fight and assaults another student. The student's suspended from the residence for a period of 2 weeks or maybe longer. Students are aware that assaulting another student will result in suspension from the residence. So I'd just like to make a comment about the way we use these consequences. So we need to use our own professional judgment rather than just allocating the same consequence every single time. So let me give you an example. You have a student who has this outburst and is swearing and using offensive language, at the pool table, and you talk to that student. Now, the student might say, look, I'm really very sorry, that's out of character. I'm, very sorry I did that. I won't do that again. And so that would be very different to a student who said, look, I'll swear if I want to, you can't tell me what to do. And so you can see there's those two different responses, and they would require different approaches or different consequences. We can't automatically give the same consequence for each each behaviour. You're going to need to use your judgment as well. There are some guidelines for using negative consequences. We need to make clear what the problem behaviour is and the consequence. We need to deliver the consequence, not just threaten. The severity is not as important as the certainty. We need to be consistent. Students won't learn if they sometimes get away with it. You only use safe, respectful consequences. Don't give consequences in public. Deliver the consequence in a calm way without showing emotion. Showing emotion will only cause the students to react emotionally. Only use the negative consequences if positive interventions aren't working. Okay, so let's move on and have a look at functional behaviour assessments. An FBA or functional behaviour assessment identifies where and when, and most importantly, why serious behaviours of concern happen. In schools, this is called a function of the behaviour. And so you would, when an incident occurs with a student, you would fill out one of these functional behaviour assessments. And these are pretty simple and pretty straightforward. You don't need to be a trained psychologist or counsellor to do these. And the very good thing about these is if you fill them out and you're consistent about filling them out, and you can look back on a student's history and see what triggers a particular behaviour. And so these can be very useful. This information is then used to develop a behaviour intervention plan. An FBA might be carried out when a young person's behaviour gets in the way of their learning or the learning of other students, or causes harm to themselves or another, and it can be completed as often as needed. Okay, so we've talked about this already. The steps are to identify the behaviour, to gather information about events and consequences that are triggering the behaviour, and then analyse the data. After the assessment, plan interventions to change the behaviour, create a behaviour intervention support plan, implement the plan, and evaluate the effectiveness. And sources of information for the assessment: a review of the young person's school or boarding records, interviews with staff and caregivers, structured rating scales, collection of direct observation data, identify any health or well-being concerns, consideration of environmental conditions that may have impacted those behaviours. Okay, so indirect assessments may involve an interview, questionnaire, or rating scale. Direct assessments involve observing the behaviour and naturally occurring conditions without changing the environment in any way at all. Behaviour intervention plan is based on the results of the FBA, the Functional Behaviour Assessment. It's a description of the problem behaviour, theories to why the problem behaviour occurs. The behaviour intervention plan has components such as skills training to promote appropriate behaviour, changes in environment, strategies to encourage appropriate behaviours, the support needed to behave appropriately, and collection of data to measure progress. Restorative practice. This is a positive approach that works with the students, not doing things to them or for them. It helps the person be accountable for their own behaviour and to repair any harm caused. So we have this restorative window where you're doing things with students. It's a restorative process. It's not punitive, not neglectful, and not permissive. Restorative practice is more than just a series of questions. Fundamentally, it's not a blame and punish approach. It's almost opposite to a blame and punish approach. It avoids scolding, judging, lecturing, or blaming. It accepts that we all make mistakes and we all have the ability to fix a problem. We can learn from our experiences. So instead of asking, what has happened, who's to blame, and how can we punish them. That's a blame and punish approach. Instead, it says, what happened, how did it make you feel, and how can we fix this up? And so you can see typical restorative questions here. What happened? What were you thinking at the time? What have you thought about since? Who's been affected by it? How can we make things right? And that's from Real Justice. This form here is used to tell your story, so to explain what happened, your side of what happened, and that form is used in schools. So this is a very powerful approach to resolving particularly relationship issues between students, and you can also use it for relationship issues between staff as well. But it's very powerful and very effective. Recording and reporting. We need to keep detailed records of instances of challenging and disruptive behaviour, serious behaviours of concern, and the organisation's responses. These should be consistent with organisation policies and procedures. They should focus on the facts and not include vague or unsubstantiated claims or judgments. Recording and reporting processes. Many schools use a student management program such as REACH, and this will have online reporting processes on it, or they'll use incident reporting forms in student folders in the school online system, or possibly even hard copies. More serious situations will need a critical incident report. So question 32 asks you, how does your residents report and record behaviour incidents, behaviours of concern, etc.? We need to maintain currency of documents. So we need to set up a review schedule. We need to monitor software for updates. We need to have a version control on documents, update links and references in our documents, and continually check for consistency. Question 32 asks, how does your residents report and record behaviour incidents and critical incidents? Section 5, aggressive and violent behaviour. Responding to escalating behaviour, getting in early. Escalating behaviour can resemble fight or flight response. Aggressive and violent behaviour can cause significant harm to the student, others who are around them, and even property. Early intervention during the warning signs may prevent escalation. Focus on addressing the behaviour as soon as you can before it fully escalates. The model we use looks like this. It seeks to identify the different stages of escalation and opportunities and strategies to intervene and address the escalation as soon as possible. You can see the different stages: the default stage, pre-escalation, escalation, fully escalated, de-escalation, and post-escalation. So that's the 6 stages of the model. De-escalation goes against the natural fight or flight response. So when you get a student who is angry, they're swearing at you, they're aggressive, then we naturally have this fight or flight response. And in de-escalation, we want the opposite approach. It requires a calm, strategic approach. Learning and practice are essential. Each incident of escalating behaviour will be different, and the model will have a different shape for each incident. So, for example, in this model here, escalation has occurred very rapidly, and there's hardly any pre-escalation at all, so it's a different shape. Full escalation usually only lasts a short time, maybe a few minutes, but it can continue for a lot longer, even as long as 20 minutes. And you can see on this model, the shape is different with a long, fully elevated stage. In any escalation incident, there are multiple opportunities to intervene and respond. This can be during pre-escalation, can be during the escalation phase, or when a student is fully escalated. Responding as early as possible will reduce the likelihood of harm to the escalating person and others. Preventative measures. Number 1 is build strong relationships, foster trust, Show genuine care and interest in students' lives and feeling. Practice active listening. Acknowledge students' concerns without judgment. Use students' names and personalise interactions. Number 2, set clear expectations. Define expectations up front. Ensure students understand behavioural expectations and consequences. Model desired behaviours. Demonstrate respect, patience, and problem-solving skills. Use positive reinforcement. Highlight and reward appropriate behaviours. Create a supportive environment. Minimise triggers. Reduce environmental stresses such as loud noise, crowding, or overwhelming tasks. Provide structured routines. Predictable routines help reduce anxiety. Offer flexible options and adjust tasks or activities to meet individual needs. Teach self-regulation skills. Encourage emotional awareness. Help students identify and express their feelings constructively. For example, you could say, "You seem upset. Can you tell me what's bothering you?" Provide coping strategies. Teach breathing techniques, mindfulness, calming exercises. Use visual aids such as emotion indicators or calm areas. And then prepare yourself. Managing escalating behaviour requires conscious preparation, as de-escalation involves actions that are not instinctive. To guide this process, use the BEAT, B-E-A-T acronym. B-E-A-T. B stands for body language and breathing. Control your body language by keeping hands visible, palms open, movements slow to signal non-aggression. Breathe evenly. Project calmness through controlled breathing. E, emotions. Ego. Be in control of your emotions. Our responses must be calm, composed, and not angry or defensive. Regulate your emotions. Is your ego getting in the way? A, avoid. Avoid power struggles, judgment, or smart comments. Avoid statements like, "You need to calm down," or "Stop behaving that way," or "Here we go again." And the T stands for tone. Regulate your tone. Speak softly and slowly with empathy, avoiding a loud or authoritative tone. Stage 1 is default behaviour. Default behaviour is a young person's general behaviour, everyday behaviour, when they're not in a pre-escalation or an escalation state. There can be underlying triggers or past traumas. Triggers are specific events, stimuli, or circumstances that provoke a reaction. For students, these might be sensory, emotional, social, or environmental factors that lead to escalated behaviours. Trigger examples include a sudden loud noise or a change in routine, a specific tone or voice or language that the student perceives as critical, being called out in front of peers or feeling excluded, perception of negative behaviours, or signs from other students such as teasing, ridiculing, and mocking. The impact of triggers. Triggers often lead to immediate, short-term behavioural reactions like anger, frustration, or withdrawal. These reactions can escalate quickly, if not de-escalated or managed. Then we have trauma. Trauma relates to the emotional, psychological, or physical harm resulting from adverse experiences or events, such as abuse, neglect, loss, or violence. Trauma affects how a student perceives and reacts to the world. Trauma examples include a history of family conflict or instability, experiencing bullying or discrimination, witnessing or being part of a traumatic event such as a natural disaster or a serious impact. Trauma impacts shape a student's worldview and responses over the long term. Students with unresolved trauma may misinterpret neutral or minor situations, such as threatening, leading to escalated behaviours such as aggression, defiance, running, hiding, or extreme anxiety. So the main differences here: triggers cause an immediate reaction that can be managed by addressing the present situation. Trauma may lead to ongoing dysregulation and hypervigilant, making the student more prone to misinterpreting and reacting to triggers. Identifying and understanding a student's trauma and triggers can help prevent escalation. So how can we do this? How can boarding staff develop this understanding, and what questions are even appropriate to ask? When addressing a student's trauma, it's important to approach the situation with sensitivity, respect, and clear boundaries. Respect the student's privacy, focus on needs and not details, and then engage with support systems, other people who are supporting the student. Identifying triggers. This comes out of building trust and rapport, asking open-answered questions, using visual tools. Observe behaviour and patterns, look for early warning signs, and track incidents by maintaining a log, network with others, and consider environmental factors. So that was stage 1. Then we have pre-escalation, stage 2. These are the very early warning signs. Now, a few notes here. These are much easier to notice if you've engaged with a person and developed a positive relationship with them. The very early warning signs of escalating behaviour are often subtle and can be easy to overlook. These signs generally indicate that a person is beginning to feel distressed, frustrated, or agitated. Early warning signs of escalating behaviour can be irritating or annoying, but it's important to avoid reacting aggressively, emotionally, or defensively, even if the initial instinct is to reprimand. Early intervention through attentive, respectful engagement and empathy, such as offering food, space, a break, this can prevent escalation and reduce harm. Pre-escalation, the very early warning signs, and you can see this on the model here. Stage 2, pre-escalation, probably triggered by some event or something that has occurred or some situation for the young person. But this is the pre-escalation stage. Situational triggers could include environmental stresses such as crowding, noise, some sort of sensory overload, unmet needs such as hunger, fatigue, or emotional upset from an earlier event such as peer conflict. Physical signs include changing in posture, becoming tense, crossing arms or withdrawing physically, fidgeting, repeated movements like tapping fingers, bouncing a leg or playing with objects, eye behaviour, avoiding eye contact, glaring or looking around nervously, changes in breathing, slightly quicker or deeper breaths or audible sighs. Verbal signs are tone changes, voice becomes sharper or quieter or strained, unusual speech patterns, talking faster or slower than normal or becoming unusually quiet. Mild complaints, expressing dissatisfaction in or frustration in a low-key way. Example, this is stupid, or I hate this. Subtle sarcasm or defiance, making underhand comments or questioning authority lightly. Because remember, these are the very early warning signs. Emotional signs are restlessness, difficulty focusing or showing signs of impatience, irritability, easily annoyed by peers or minor events, mood shifts, so a noticeable change from their earlier or their usual demeanour, like from cheerful to withdrawn. Behavioural signs are withdrawal, so pulling away from the group, avoiding participation, disengaging from activities. Fixation, focusing intensely on a specific issue or problem. Rule testing, beginning to challenge small rules such as talking out of turn or ignoring instructions. So preventative strategies for early signs. And this is question 29. So first of all, prepare yourself. BEAT, the acronym. Check in gently. Ask open, non-threatening questions to gauge feelings. Example, you seem a bit upset today. Is everything okay? Offer help and provide aid if they're struggling with a task. So example, can I help you with this homework? Redirect attention. So offer alternatives, options or solutions. Engage in calming activity if appropriate. Clearly state acceptable behaviour. I want to help, but I need you to lower your voice so we can talk. Use I statements. Now, you're not going to do this when a student is escalating or fully escalating, but you would do it when there is a very early warning sign, because You're wanting to try and step in early and to stop the escalation. Try and create space, allow a moment to process without pressure. So you might say, look, let's take a short break and we'll come back to that. Use positive reinforcement, highlight strengths or good behaviour to shift focus. You might say, I've noticed you're really focused on your work today. Promote peer support, promote empathy, encourage other students to support one another instead of increasing attention. Address peer disputes quickly and fairly to prevent escalation. So that is the very early or pre-escalation stage. Now we want to look at escalating behaviour, where behaviour is definitely escalating. So the signs, situational triggers are frustrational build-up, unresolved problems or feeling to be unheard, triggered by the environment, unmet needs such as hunger, fatigue or physical discomfort, body language changes, these are physical signs, clenched fists, rigid posture, pacing, exaggerated movements, facial expressions, red face, furrowed brows, wide eyes, jaw tightening, increased physical attention, grinding teeth, trembling, rapid breathing, proximity, moving closer aggressively or invading other people's personal space. So these are the physical signs of escalating behaviour. Verbal signs, raised voice, speaking louder or shouting, abusive language, swearing, insults or threats, repetition, repeating complaints or demands with increased intensity, rapid or slow speech, speaking very quickly, indicating anxiety or frustration, or slowly and deliberately increasing control or calculation. Emotional signs include irritability, reactive to very minor triggers, very defensive, overwhelmed, agitation, hyperactivity or inability to focus. Behavioural signs include increased conflict, engaging in arguments or provoking others, withdrawal, suddenly engaging and then avoiding communication, rule breaking, acting out of character or breaking established norms, destructive actions, slamming objects, throwing items or damaging properties. So how do we address this? Strategies to address this: first of all, check yourself, make sure that you're okay. Go back to this acronym BEAT. Make sure there's safe spaces, so reduce triggers, particularly any audience or other students that are part of this issue. Encourage movement if possible. If it's possible, walk the young person. So go outside and walk with the young person. Remove access to any dangerous objects. Active listening and clear speaking. Validate emotions without necessarily agreeing. I can see you're upset. Use short, simple sentences and avoid arguing or overly explaining. Use a low, steady tone to model calmness. Acknowledge feelings and offer support, so show empathy. Look, it's okay to feel frustrated. Let's work out how to work through this together. And we need to avoid dismissing emotions or jumping straight to problem solving because this person is escalating. Give them space and sometimes give them some autonomy, a bit of control. So that is escalation, or when a young person is escalating. Then we come to stage 5, full escalation. And this is when the person is in that full fight or flight mode. When they are fully escalated, their behaviour becomes very intense and is going to pose a risk to themselves or other people. And they may no longer be able to reason or control their effects because of that fight or flight mode that they're in. Physical signs: aggressive body language, lunging, advancing towards others, or exaggerated gestures, tense or rigid postures, muscles visibly tight, fists clenched or pacing erratically, heightened physical energy, increased movement, restlessness or inability to stay still, rapid breathing and sweating, physical signs of adrenaline surge, and physical violence, hitting, throwing objects, smashing stuff up, damaging property. Verbal signs are yelling or screaming, loud, forceful speech, threats, explicit statements of harm directed at others or even themselves, profanity and insults, increased use of hostile language and name-calling, incoherence, difficulty in expressing thoughts logically with disjointed and repetitive speech. Emotive signs are extreme anger or rage, visible inability to control their emotional outbursts, overwhelming frustration, crying, expression, despair, mixed with anger, lack of self-awareness, seeming disconnected from the consequences of their behaviour. Behavioural signs are attempts to grab, push or strike others, disregard for boundaries, ignoring requests to stop, self-harm, hitting themselves, pulling hair or other self-injurious actions, total disengagement. For some, escalation can manifest as a complete withdrawal, becoming non-verbal or catatonic. Okay, so how do we address this? Strategies for responding to the fully escalated situation, and you need to check yourself first using this acronym BEAT. Then you're going to need to try to ensure safety. So you need to maintain your own safety during this period. It can be quite dangerous when a young person is like this. Assess the environment, identify potential risks to yourself, to the individual and to other students nearby. Make sure there's no sharp objects or anything that could become a weapon. Remove other students, if possible discreetly, move them away from the area to ensure their safety and to reduce the audience for the behaviour. Position yourself strategically, stand at an angle to the person, not directly in front, and this reduces the appearance of confrontation, and it allows a safe exit path if they want to exit. Maintain a safe distance, so keep at least 2 arms length between yourself and the person. Use active listening, so acknowledge their emotions. I can see you're upset right now. Avoid judgment, and you don't have to agree or disagree with their behaviour. Just do not argue or challenge. And so you minimise any sort of commands, avoid any sort of physical contact. So don't attempt to touch or restrain the person. And the only time you would restrain is if there was real and immediate danger that they would hurt themselves or another person. And again here, you need to be aware of your own safety. Make sure you're safe and that you're, feeling safe to do that. So again, I just want to repeat that. The only time you would restrain a person when they're in a fully escalated state is if there was real and immediate danger they would harm themselves or another person. Provide choices and solutions. Give the student a sense of control. Do you want to sit here or do you want to walk? What would help right now? Try and focus on immediate needs. And you may need to call for assistance. If the person's behaviour escalates beyond control or poses an immediate threat, involve trained personnel such as security personnel, counsellors or police. Be very aware of the wider repercussions of involving police, and only do this if it's absolutely necessary, no other options, particularly for young people with prior trauma, or some condition or negative experiences such as racial discrimination. Also, if you're going to involve police, then try to ensure that there's no spectators or others involved nearby. If you can involve trusted contacts, bring in a person that they trust. Use organisation resources, so you may have to use the school security or behaviour support team. Very often this is going down so quickly that you don't really have the time and the opportunity to engage support systems. But if you can, then that can be very helpful. So you may need to provide space for the young person, allow cooling off time, sometimes stepping away or providing them with a quiet space to regroup can de-escalate the situation. And, staying safe, monitor from a safe distance, stay close enough to respond, but far enough to reduce perceived threat and make sure the situation is safe for yourself. So that's when a student is fully escalated or in that fight or flight stage. Afterwards, they begin to de-escalate, and we need to support them through this process as well. So this is stage 5 on this model. Ensure safety first, make sure the student and others are physically safe, give them space, but remain present and available. Use a calm and non-threatening tone. Acknowledge their emotions and avoid dismissing or in any way minimising their experiences. And offer them some sort of grounding techniques or self-regulation techniques if you feel that's appropriate. The most important thing here is that you give them time. So don't rush this process, because this can take quite some time. It can take up to 30 minutes or even longer. Then stage 7, post-escalation. What do we do after escalation? So we look at this in terms of the team and then also the student. So let's firstly look at the team. After the incident, you're going to want to advise the manager, parents or guardians, and document the incident. And then you're going to need to check in with the team members that were involved. So that's those people that were involved through this fully escalated stage. Offer support to anyone impacted by the event. So this can be very confronting. Can be like a trauma itself to team members. So provide an opportunity for team members to talk about the incident, how it affected them, and you may even have to provide referral to a counsellor or a psychologist. It's good to debrief and reflect with the team. Analyse what triggered the escalation. Is there some way to avoid or reduce exposure to the triggers in the future? Could our response have occurred earlier? Was the response effective? Is there a better way to respond? So you would debrief with the team and reflect with the team. After the incident with the student, you're going to debrief the student, but you may have to wait, may have to wait till they're ready. So debrief when they're ready, when they're calm, have a conversation about what happened. Try and reintegrate positively, offer reassurance and a fresh start, normalise emotional struggles and emphasise growth, encourage student to rejoin activities when they feel ready. Now, you may have to, tailor this depending on the severity of the incident. If at the height of escalation, if a young person has injured other people, if they have smashed up property, injured themselves, this is going to need to be taken into account as well. It's going to be very important to create a plan. So you want to plan for the future. What's going to happen if the young person is feeling like they're escalating in the future? What can they do? So involve the support team, work with counsellors or behavioural specialists to create a plan for the student. That's triggers, coping strategies, how to identify when they are starting to escalate and what they can do about it. After you've got a plan, monitor the plan, encourage reflection, and allow a regular check-in person to monitor and review the plan. So it is allocate a regular check-in person. So that's the different stages of escalation from a student when they're in their default situation until after the incident. Physical restraint and intervention. Physical restraint is the use of physical force to prevent, restrict or subdue the movement of a student's body or part of their body, they are not free to walk away. So you've restrained them. Intervention is where you block, deflect or redirect actions or disengage a grip, but the student can move freely away. So that's the difference between restraint and intervention. Restraint should only be used in very exceptional circumstances where there's real and immediate risk of injury to the student or to others, where there is no less restrictive measure to use in the circumstances, and where it is a reasonable response to prevent harm. And I should say that this happens very rarely in my life since the 1970s, working in a range of different schools. With some students who were at-risk students, I've only had to do this about 3 times. And the first time I had to do this was with a young student in a woodwork class, and they were about to stab another student in the chest with a wood chisel. And so I had to restrain that student because there was real and immediate risk of injury to that student. So just repeating that, the only time you would ever use it is in exceptional circumstances where there is real and immediate risk of injury to themselves or to another person. You don't use it if there is a risk of injury to yourself, and you make sure your actions are consistent with your organisation's policies and procedures. And it's good to do some PD training around this if you can. Most organisations prohibit physical restraint that covers a student's mouth or nose in any way, interferes with breathing, takes a student to the ground in a prone or supine position, applies pressure to the neck, back, chest or joints, applies pain to gain compliance, intentionally causes a student to fall, or includes a person sitting, lying or kneeling on a student. So most organisations around Australia prohibit that sort of physical restraint. After physical restraint, because it can be very confronting for both the person doing the restraining and also for the student. So provide support for both the students and staff involved. Make sure the head of boarding knows about the incident and document the incident. Notify parents or carers, and then review the incident. Check for alternative actions or preventative or de-escalation strategies that will reduce the likelihood of it ever happening again. Student referrals. Some behaviours result in referrals to specialists such as counsellors, psychologists, psychiatrists and other health professionals. Referrals will often be made by the case management team or the residence or school specialists such as behaviour specialists or the nurse or your wellbeing team. Policies and procedures for referrals detail permissions that are required, which is usually the parent or the student, depending on age, and the residents or the organisation management. So question 36 asks, what is your organisation's process for referring students for specialist advice and support? Section 6, self-harm and suicide. Self-harm, when the physical pain masks the internal pain. So when a young person feels this terrible pain within themselves, then an external pain such as cutting themselves reduces that internal pain. Or it may be the need to just feel something, away from that numbness or depression. It's not an indication of suicide intention, but it can lead to it. What they need is to be supported and cared about. Suicide. Supervisors become aware of suicide risk by observing behaviour, so indicators, or some person tells the supervisor. So that person might be the student themselves, it might be their friend, or it might be another person who tells the supervisor. Risk factors are previous suicide attempts using substances such as drugs and alcohol, having a mental health condition, problems with family or romantic relationships, legal problems, a recent death or suicide of a family member or close friend, being bullied, having access to harmful medication or weapons, having a physical illness or disability, being gay, lesbian, bisexual, gender diverse or intersex, being Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. There's some statistics here on suicide deaths of children and young people 2010 to 2020. Prior to 2010, the suicide rates amongst young people were a lot higher. They were about 18 or 19 deaths per 100,000, and over a 10-year period to 2010, it reduced down to about 8 or 9 deaths per 100,000. You can see from this chart that the deaths amongst 18 to 24-year-olds are much higher, probably about 11, up to 16 per 100,000. They're lower for 15 to 17-year-olds, and for 14-year-olds and below, they're quite low. So what are the protective factors? It's definitely connection through family, school or community, through significant others, the presence of a caring adult or a caring partner. And so this connection with a group of people is just very important as a protective factor. Personal resilience associated with coping styles and problem solving, spirituality and beliefs, a sense of meaning, spiritual faith, and also a belief that suicide is wrong. Good health, positive physical and mental health is protective. Early detection and treatment of disorders such as depression, restricted access to weapons, controlling prescription of certain drugs, etc. There's lots of indicators. Sometimes after a suicide, people will feel that they had no idea that this could possibly happen. But if they look back, they may have seen some of these indicators, such as pulling away from friends, loss of interest in activities, trouble concentrating, giving away belongings, talking about death, suicide, feeling hopeless or feeling guilty, changing sleep or eating habits, sudden trouble in school or boarding, sudden change such as calmness after a period of anxiety, self-destructive behaviours such as heavy drinking, heavy drug use or cutting. So when we look at this in two ways. Students who are down, not themselves. So we wouldn't see these students necessarily as a suicide risk. And then students who are at risk of suicide. These are suicide risk students. So firstly, let's have a look at students who are down, not themselves. They might appear depressed. So we monitor these, we discuss these students with other staff, with professionals such as your wellbeing team, and we document what we're seeing with these young people. We don't leave them alone, buddy them up with other students, encourage activity or connection, just show that you care, show that you're available and you can listen with empathy, and access help and support for these young people, a care plan or referral. They can even use helplines if they want to. There's helplines such as these, Kids Helpline, Lifeline, Headspace, etc. Now, if these students who are down, not themselves, are not improving but getting worse, then you may consider that these students are a suicide risk. Students at risk of suicide, firstly, you refer to your procedure, your boarding procedure, but you can ask these students very directly, are you thinking of taking your own life? And the reason we do that is we're wanting to find out, are they seriously thinking of taking their own life? And so if you asked a student that and the student said, oh, no, sir, no, it's nothing like that. My grandmother's just very ill and I'm just worried about her and I've just been really concerned about her. So that's one response that you might get. Or you might get a response where somebody says, oh, yes, well, things have been really tough. My girlfriend's left me. Life has been crap for me. And so you can see the differences in those responses and how you would, really think that one of those students was definitely at risk of suicide. You need to make sure that this is appropriate for your role. So this is asking very directly, are you thinking of taking your own life? Don't leave the student alone at all. So that's even to go to the toilet. So if they want to go to the toilet, you would stand outside and you would talk to the student and make sure they're not in there for a protracted period of time. You'd advise the boarding manager and anyone else who needs to know, including parents, and you would get professional assistance immediately. And that usually means getting a student off to the mental health department in the local hospital. So you'll document this, update student files, and keep the staff informed. So just going over this again, students who are at risk of suicide, number 1, ask very directly, are you thinking of taking your own life? Number 2, do not leave the student alone. Number 3, advise all the people who should know. Number 4, get professional assistance immediately. Number 5, document, update the student file, and keep staff informed. Now, after the student returns to the residence, make sure that you've got 2 things in place. A risk management process. How are you going to manage risk when the student returns to the residence? And an individual care plan. This is necessary for ongoing monitoring, care and documentation. Residence response, there should be these steps: a return to residence, school meeting, which would include school staff, the parent or guardian, external support agents, and if appropriate, the student. A risk management process, and this really should have been carried out by the hospital. Develop or review an individual care plan, inform and update teachers and supervisors, and manage the safety of the student. Appendix 1 are legal and ethical considerations related to addressing behaviours of concern. Appendix 1 looks at legal and ethical considerations related to addressing behaviours of concern. And this is a table, and if you complete this table for question 38, and it covers duty of care, individual rights and equality, constraint, imprisonment, and abuse. So let's have a quick look at those. Duty of care. In a boarding school, duty of care refers to the responsibility of staff to take reasonable steps to protect students from harm and ensure their safety. Organisational practice includes establishing policies and procedures for managing behaviours of concern, such as anti-bullying programs and behaviour management, providing staff with training in identifying and responding to potential risks or harmful situations, regularly reviewing and updating risk management strategies. Individual practice is supervising students appropriately and intervening when there's a risk of harm, addressing behaviours of concern promptly and effectively, documenting incidents and actions. Individual rights and equality. Students have the right to be treated with dignity and equality irrespective of their background, abilities or behaviour. Organisation practice includes implementing inclusive policies that respect diversity and prohibit discrimination or unfair treatment, ensuring behaviour management strategies do not unfairly target or disadvantage particular groups of people. Individual practice, treating all students equitably and avoiding biases when addressing behaviours of concern, adapting behaviour management strategies to suit individual needs, and upholding student rights to be heard. Constraint. This involves limiting a student's movements or actions through physical restraint to prevent immediate harm. Organisation practice, establishing clear guidelines on the use of constraint that complies with legal and ethical standards, providing staff with de-escalation and conflict resolution training, monitoring and reviewing all incidents involving constraint. Individual practice, using restraint only as a last resort according to organisation policies and procedures, ensuring that any constraint is proportionate, least restrictive, time limited and documented thoroughly, prioritising alternative strategies. Imprisonment. In boarding school context, imprisonment refers to restricting a student's freedom of movement, such as locking them in a room. This is very unlikely to happen in boarding, except in very extreme situations. Organisational practice involving clear policies and procedures on lawful and ethical ways to manage safety concerns. Individual practice, avoiding any action that could be interpreted as unlawful detention, such as locking a student in a room without legal and procedural justification. Abuse. Abuse involves any action that causes emotional, physical, psychological or neglect-related harm to a student, either intentionally or through negligence. The organisation practice is enforcing zero tolerance for all forms of abuse and ensuring staff are aware of their mandatory reporting requirements, establishing safeguarding protocols and regular reviewing practices to ensure compliance with child protection laws, providing training to recognise and respond to signs of abuse. Individual practice, acting immediately if abuse is suspected by reporting to Child Protection Services, avoiding any behaviour that could cause harm, including harsh discipline or neglect. And so that's the end of that table, and that's assessment 38. And that's the end of this unit. And it's a very large unit. And I'd ask you as soon as you can to send your assessments in to us, and we'll mark them and get them back to you. Thank you very much.